The first reference to what would eventually be called dyslexia was actually in 1877. The term dyslexia wasn't coined until like 6 years later in 1883, but in 1877, there was a neurologist named Adolf Kussmaul who was working with patients who had experienced a partial loss of their ability to read after having traumatic brain injuries. And he theorized that there might be a different region of the brain that was responsible for reading than the ones that we use for vision or for speaking. Which is very impressive that he figured that out, because then for the next like 20 years, a lot of the people who were looking at dyslexia, who were looking at patients who experienced the traumatic brain injuries and lost parts of their ability to read, a lot of them were ophthalmologists, because people would be like, well, I'm struggling to read, that must be a vision thing. And it's fascinating that the first guy who came up with word blindness, the first guy who came up with that term, kind of hit the nail on the head in figuring out maybe there's a different region of the brain that's responsible for this. And then somehow after that, there were a few decades where people got kind of confused and were like, no, maybe it's an eye thing. Maybe it might be an eye thing. And it wasn't until like 30, 40 years later where it really became kind of standardized to think, no, there's a different region of the brain that's responsible for why dyslexia exists. That's responsible for particularly developmental dyslexia. Because developmental dyslexia, which is what you have when you're born with dyslexia, that didn't really start getting talked about until about 20 years after 1877. It was in 1896 when a British doctor was working with a 14-year-old boy and was like, this is interesting. He's energetic, he's capable, he's good in most subjects in school, and yet he's struggling to read in a way that doesn't really make sense. Like, that was the first reference we have to developmental dyslexia where there was no other explanation besides maybe there's something different about how he functions that makes this harder for him. And it's just fascinating hearing how it's like, well, the first person who talked about it kind of figured it out. But then a bunch of other people came along and were like, oh, we're not sure. We think this might be an eye thing. And it wasn't until much later that they were like, no, he might have been right. There might have been something else happening in the brain that led to this. And I think that's fascinating. And also it's just really funny that this guy who lived so long before we had the technology to really like see more and more of what's going on in brains kind of figured it out. Like he couldn't have probably told you exactly what parts of the brain or why, but he still figured out that, it seems like there's something here. And then of course people who were in different professions and had different opinions were like, are we sure? I think it's this other thing for a while before we came back to that. Super interesting.